I want you to imagine something for a second. You walk into a medical clinic, right? And you are expecting this seasoned medical detective.
Right. Someone who is going to really look at you.
Exactly. Someone who will investigate your specific symptoms. But instead, you slowly start to realize that you are actually just on a corporate assembly line.
A very rigid assembly line, yeah.
Yeah, and your entire treatment is just being dictated by this inflexible flay chart.
Huh.
So what happens when a doctor, actually tries to hit the emergency stop button on that assembly line because it is literally hurting people?
Well, based on the documents we are looking at today, the system essentially destroys them.
It does. And that is exactly what we are unpacking in this deep dive. We are acting as your investigative guides today, digging into a massive, highly charged stack of whistleblower documents.
Yeah, these are audio files, written statements, and direct accounts from Doctor Kadali M Srivatsa. He is a veteran intensive care unit doctor and a general practitioner who spent over 40 years in the UK's National Health Service.
Right, the NHS. And just to set the parameters right up front for you listening, we have a very specific mission today. The claims we are exploring contain incredibly serious, politically charged allegations against massive state institutions.
Massive ones. We are talking about the General Medical Council or the GMC, the Royal Colleges, local medical councils, the whole regulatory apparatus.
Exactly. And to be completely clear, we are not here to take sides. We aren't endorsing specific viewpoints or declaring legal guilt. Our job is just to rigorously unpack the evidence and the narratives presented in this specific source material.
So you can actually understand this really profound ethical battle that the sources say is happening right now behind closed clinic doors.
Right, because the core conflict here is staggering. Dr. Srivatsa's documents, specifically his updated statement about the GMC and his proposed solutions, allege that these organizations we trust to protect patients are actually colluding.
Yeah, colluding to conceal systemic failures, and that they actively harass, humiliate, and systematically ostracize doctors who challenge their protocols.
Especially doctors who challenge things like the NICE guidelines. So let's start there. Let's look at the actual architecture of this machine. Because the sources argue that modern medicine has undergone this huge structural shift.
It has. There's an audio source in the files titled Truth About Modern Medicine, and it uses a really fascinating phrase. It says the system is operating on a mathematically broken compass.
A mathematically broken compass. Break that down for us. What does that actually mean in a clinic?
Well, it refers to advisory bodies, mostly NICE. That is the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. They evaluate treatments using huge amounts of population-level statistical data.
Right, looking at averages.
Exactly. They use metrics like quality-adjusted life years to see what is cost-effective, and then they issue these clinical guidelines.
But historically, a guideline is just a guide, right? Like if you are sailing a ship, the guideline is the lighthouse. It tells you where the rocks are.
Sure, but the captain still steers the ship. That is traditional medicine. The doctor is the captain using clinical judgment. But the sources argue these guidelines have mutated. They aren't helpful suggestions anymore.
They are mandates.
They are rigid, legally binding mandates. So the compass is broken because it forces every doctor to point toward the statistical average, no matter what unique patient is sitting in front of them.
Okay, but let me play devil's advocate here for a second. If you look at a socialized system like the NHS, you are managing the health of over 60 million people. You have finite resources.
Right. It is a massive logistical challenge.
Yeah, so standardization isn't just nice to have, it is practically an operational necessity. Without flowcharts, how do you manage triage?
Yeah.
How do you stop a rogue doctor from just prescribing wild, unproven stuff?
And that is exactly the institutional defense. They say standardization raises the baseline of safety. But Dr. Srivatsa's material forces us to look at the collateral damage of that standardization.
The people who fall outside the average.
Exactly. Because strict adherence to a population average actively devalues outliers.
Yeah.
If a patient is disabled or elderly or has, complex overlapping autoimmune issues, they do not fit in that statistical box.
And the sources call this cookbook medicine, right?
Yeah, cookbook medicine. The result is that junior doctors and nurse practitioners end up just ticking corporate boxes on pre-printed sheets. They aren't really listening to the patient's unique story.
They are just satisfying the spreadsheet. And the documents actually bring up a specific legal case to show how severe this is, the Elizabeth Rose case.
That case is terrifying if you are a doctor. A clinical commissioning group actually refused to follow a specific guideline because they felt there was a lack of evidence for it in that specific situation.
They use their professional judgment.
Right. But it went to court, and the judge ruled that simply disagreeing with the guidance was not a sufficient legal defense.
Wait, really? So even if your 40 years of experience tells you a standard treatment will hurt the specific person in front of you, the law says you have to do it anyway.
Pretty much. You are legally punished for treating the individual instead of the statistic. And Dr. Srivatsa brings in this ancient Indian philosophy to explain this. He talks about dharma.
Dharma, meaning like ethical duty.
Yeah, inner order, ethical duty, and a really deep awareness of localized context. That is the traditional healer, looking at the whole person. But the modern clinical bureaucracy is described as adharma.
Moral chaos.
Exactly. Removing human empathy just to blindly serve a corporate algorithm is a dharma. And this isn't just abstract philosophy. For Dr. Srivatsa, it created a genuinely dangerous reality on the clinic floor.
Right, so let's get into the timeline. Around 2006, he was working in a PMS practice. What does PMS stand for again?
Personal medical services.
Yeah.
These were contracts designed to give local primary care providers flexibility. But the financial reality meant they were always looking for ways to deliver care more cheaply.
Right, and he was in a practice managed largely by nurses, and this is where the sources describe this really dangerous blurring of professional boundaries.
Yes, nurses, who are incredible but just don't have the same decade-long diagnostic training as doctors, were being pushed to take on really complex diagnostic responsibilities.
And there is this analogy in the video sources that just perfectly nails what is going on here. The structural engineer versus the electrician.
It is a great analogy. The Whistleblower compares this nurse-led diagnostic model to hiring an electrician to do a structural engineer's job,
Yeah.
just because the electrician is cheaper.
Which makes sense on a budget sheet, maybe. But mechanically, think about building a house. You need an electrician. They know wiring and safety codes inside out.
But they don't know the physics of a load-bearing wall.
Exactly. So if the manager tells the electrician to calculate foundational stress, they might just drill a huge hole right through a vital support beam to run a wire.
And the lights turn on today, the manager thinks they saved money.
But a month later, the roof completely collapses. And that architectural collapse is exactly what the documents show happening in the human body.
It really is. The system was using highly capable nurses for tasks outside their training. And the files give us specific, documented realities. The eczema case is a prime example.
Oh yeah, let's walk through the clinical mechanics of that one, because it connects to something so much bigger.
So a patient comes to the walk-in clinic with a complex rash. The nurse, relying on a pre-printed triage flowchart, looks at it. The flowchart says a red, itchy rash is probably eczema.
So they prescribe a topical steroid, because that is the protocol.
Right. But the rash wasn't eczema. It was an active infection.
And what happens when you put a steroid on an infection? This is where the structural engineer knowledge matters.
Usually. A steroid does not kill bacteria. It suppresses the local immune response to reduce inflammation.
So it's basically like turning off the fire alarms while pouring gasoline on the fire?
That is exactly what it is. The redness might go away for a day, so the nurse thinks it worked, but underneath, the bacteria is just multiplying wildly because the immune system was turned off.
And the sources link this specific type of flowchart error to antimicrobial resistance, AMR.
The superbugs. Misdiagnosing infections and giving the wrong treatments is directly fueling the mutation of deadly superbugs. The bacteria learn to survive, and eventually they end up in hospitals.
So why does the NHS allow this? If it's creating superbugs, why incentivize a structure that does this?
Financial pressure, the fee-for-service model, and brutal budgets. Replacing qualified doctors with cheaper, nurse-led clinics saves millions up front.
But the sources argue it totally compromises diagnostic safety. They are trading long-term public health for short-term budget goals.
And most doctors facing that would just put their head down, right? But Dr. Srivatsa engineered a solution. He created a tool called Dr. Maya.
Yeah, the Dr. Maya tool. And this is fascinating because it started as literally a fridge magnet, right?
A physical fridge magnet. It was a color-coded symptoms and signs list for receptionists and independent nurse prescribers.
And how did it work mechanically?
It was a hard safety net. If a patient's symptom triggered a red color on the list, the protocol mandated that the nurse or receptionist must speak to a fully qualified doctor before making any decision.
So it's the emergency stop cord on the assembly line. It wasn't belittling the nurses. It was just giving them a clear, objective boundary to protect them and the patient.
But the reaction to it from the staff really exposes the psychology of the system. The documents quote a nurse manager confronting him about the Dr. Maya tool.
I remember this quote. It is wild.
She refused to use it, and she said, quote, "You are sending me back to the coffin that I took a year to walk out. We are independent nurse prescribers and have nurses pharmacopoeia, similar to BNF, to guide and prescribe."
We have to unpack that language. First of all, the BNF.
British National Formulary.
Correct.
It is the standard prescribing reference for doctors in the UK.
So she's saying her nurse's pharmacopoeia gives her the exact same diagnostic weight as a doctor's guide. But the word that really gets me is coffin.
Yeah, coffin.
Yeah.
It's incredibly charged.
Why use a word like that?
Because she didn't see the tool as patient protection. She saw it as a professional demotion. Having to consult a doctor for a red flag was a coffin restricting her independence.
The focus totally shifted from the objective safety of the patient to the ego and status of the practitioner.
Exactly. And Dr. Srivatsa didn't stop there. He took this tool, along with his audit data showing the misdiagnoses and the superbug risks, and sent it directly to the Secretary of State for Health.
He literally handed the government a free tool to stop misdiagnoses.
And they ignored it entirely, threw it in a drawer.
Okay, wait. Why? What is the downside of accepting a free safety net that saves lives?
Liability. The sources point out that if the NHS adopted this tool, it would be a public admission that their cheaper nurse-led model was fundamentally unsafe without it.
They would be admitting the structural engineers were missing.
Yes, and that would invite massive lawsuits from anyone who had been harmed by a nurse-led clinic before. So they chose to protect their economic policy and their liability over the patients.
They refused to stop the assembly line. Which brings us to what happens to the guy who tries to force the line to stop. The whistleblower's punishment.
And to understand the punishment, you have to understand the ethical trap doctors are in. Because Dr. Srivatsa actually had to report this, right?
Right. The documents mention the World Medical Association code and the GMC's own good medical practice guidelines. Paragraph 75, I think.
Yes, paragraph 75. It literally mandates that a doctor must report colleagues who practice incompetently or put patients at risk.
It is not a suggestion. It is a legal and ethical requirement. If he stayed silent about the superbugs, he would lose his license.
But the manuals also give this dark warning that blowing the whistle usually leads to hostility and ostracization.
So the system says you must jump on the grenade, but acknowledges it will destroy your career.
And the timeline here is a masterclass in how that destruction happens. In 2009, he wrote to the GMC Ethical Committee. But before that, he made a protected disclosure to the Primary Care Trust, the PCT.
The PCT was his employer, basically, right? They managed local health services.
Yeah. He went to them, gave them the evidence, and asked for whistleblower confidentiality.
And what did the PCT do?
They completely breached his confidentiality. The documents allege they went straight to the nurse manager he was reporting and told her he was raising concerns about her staff.
That is like reporting police corruption to Internal Affairs, and Internal Affairs immediately calls the corrupt cop to warn them.
Exactly. And that triggered a massive retaliation playbook. Almost immediately, the nurses and a locum doctor filed counter-complaints against Dr. Srivatsa.
But they couldn't attack his clinical data because he had the proof of the misdiagnoses. So what did they complain about?
The sources call them unsubstantiated claims. They question his attitude, his professional character, and even his behavior toward female patients.
They attacked the messenger to distract from the message.
It is standard operating procedure. The PCT launched a formal investigation into him based on these claims, and the psychological toll was huge. His own GP advised him to go on sick leave.
And he was sent for psychiatric evaluation, right? This is a really dark part of the documents.
Extremely dark. The whistleblower alleges that these institutions weaponize mandatory psychiatric evaluations to suppress dissenting doctors.
Think about it. If you can label the whistleblower as, mentally unstable or having a breakdown, you entirely discredit their evidence.
Right. It changes the narrative from the doctor is exposing dangerous superbugs to the doctor is just paranoid and needs a rest.
It's gaslighting on an institutional level. They apply relentless pressure until you crack, and then use the crack as proof you were crazy all along.
And when he went to his union, the British Medical Association, the BMA, and the local medical council, the LMC, and even his solicitors.
Wait, his own designated protectors? The people whose job it is to defend doctors?
Yes. He brought them his audit data. He had the empirical proof of patient harm, and according to his 2009 letter, they explicitly advised him not to present the evidence.
They told him to bury the data.
They told him to just cooperate with the PCT to clear his own name and keep his head down.
Because fighting a systemic battle is expensive and politically dangerous for them. So the union just acts as an extension of the cover-up.
Exactly. They prioritized administrative compliance over ethical duty. So he is isolated, betrayed by his employers and his union. And this funnel eventually drops him right into the jurisdiction of the General Medical Council, the GMC.
And the GMC is the ultimate authority. Right, they hold the medical register. If they strike you off, you're done.
Your career is over. And their public face is all about protecting patient safety. But Dr. Srivatsa's documents paint a horrifying picture of their disciplinary machinery. He explicitly calls them kangaroo courts.
Kangaroo courts. How do they actually operate mechanically?
Well, the sources claim the GMC uses private agencies to review case notes, and they put inexperienced general practitioners or even lay people on panels to judge highly trained specialists.
We are talking about a guy with 40 years in intensive care. He deals with cascading organ failure and life support, and he is being judged by someone who might have never stepped foot in an ICU.
Right. It is like asking a traffic cop to evaluate the safety protocols of an airline pilot recovering from a nosedive. The evaluator just lacks the fundamental context.
There is that audio transcript in the files, the one titled GMC Harassing Challenged, where he actually confronts a GMC guy named Brian.
Yes, it is incredibly intense. You can hear decades of frustration. Dr. Srivatsa demands to know if the registrar even understands his clinical realities. He says, "A general practitioner doesn't do what I did. You can't ask a plumber to talk about your profession."
He tells them point blank, "Your institution has no right to harass doctors. I collected evidence, and instead of listening to me, the GMC decided to listen to the PCT."
And this leads into a deeply disturbing layer of the documents.
Yeah.
The sources explicitly claim the GMC machinery is racist.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because Dr. Srivatsa talks about being an Indian doctor who spent his whole life working brutal hours in intensive care.
Right, which meant he didn't have the time to build a strong community network or family support structure outside the hospital. He was very isolated.
And the argument is that the system preys on that isolation. If you don't have a powerful network, you are an easy target.
The documents make a massive claim here. They say hundreds of doctors of Indian origin have had their lives destroyed by the GMC. The prolonged harassment, the financial ruin, it takes a fatal toll. The files state many of these isolated doctors have actually committed suicide.
God. And how does the GMC handle those suicides, according to the sources?
The whistleblower alleges the GMC dismisses the deaths as just being caused by mental instability. They refuse to accept that their relentless, multi-year administrative harassment is causing severe depression and PTSD.
They wash their hands of it. They use the mental health label again to absolve themselves of driving a person to the edge. And Dr. Srivatsa says he even contemplated suicide himself under the pressure.
He did, and the pressure wasn't just defensive. He was actually going on the offensive. He was taking the Secretary of State to the High Court over these systemic failures.
Which triggers what the documents call the Oxford trap.
This is a wild sequence of events. So Dr. Srivatsa applies for a job in Oxford with NHS 111.
The non-emergency helpline.
Right. Initially, they reject him. The reason? He wasn't vaccinated against hepatitis B.
Okay, standard administrative rejection.
But then, suddenly, they totally reverse course. Inexplicably, they become desperate to hire him. They waive the requirements and push him into the position.
Why would they suddenly want a whistleblower they just rejected?
The sources allege this was a deliberate trap. The local health authorities and NHS 111 were intentionally putting him in a highly rigid algorithmic environment to gather or even fabricate evidence against him.
Because NHS 111 runs entirely on flowcharts. If you put an experienced, frustrated doctor who hates cookbook medicine into a call center, there's going to be friction.
Guaranteed friction. And the trap was to document every minor disagreement, every time he deviated from the script, to use actual clinical judgment and package it into a dossier for the GMC.
To build a profile that he is uncooperative and dangerous. But why?
Because of the High Court trial. If his case against the Secretary of State goes to trial, the government needs to discredit his Dr. Maya tool and his audit data. They need to say, look, you can't trust this guy's data on nurse misdiagnoses. He's currently under a severe GMC investigation for his terrible behavior in Oxford.
Wow. So they use one arm of the state, the NHS, to manufacture a crisis and hand it to another arm, the GMC, to legitimize it, all to protect the central government from a lawsuit.
And he explicitly notes that the Care Quality Commission, the Ombudsman, all of them were given this information. None of them stepped in. They all synchronized to protect the NHS.
So how does an investigation like this actually end? Let's look at the final resolution.
In 2013, the GMC's Interim Orders Panel, the IOP, finally concluded their review. After years of digging through his entire life, they found absolutely zero evidence that he was a threat to patients.
He was completely cleared.
Entirely cleared. They lifted all restrictions.
He won. He beat the machine.
He won the ruling, but the system made sure he lost everything else. The GMC officially lifted the restriction, but they failed to remove the public notice of the IOP investigation from their official website.
A digital red flag. And they called it an administrative error.
Just an administrative error. But the real-world consequence was absolute. Because that notice was online, no employer would touch him.
Right, because HR algorithms run a background check, see a GMC investigation notice, and immediately filter him out. He was proven innocent by the board, but professionally annihilated by a line of code.
And the human cost is just devastating. The documents describe him bankrupt, unemployable, living alone in a rented room in Germany, suffering from PTSD, all because he tried to stop misdiagnoses.
And for anyone thinking this is just a one-off fluke, the sources bring up the Bristol Royal Infirmary case to prove it is systemic.
Dr. Stephen Bolson. It's a huge historical precedent. He was an anesthetist who exposed horrifying pediatric heart surgery death rates in the 90s.
Right. The hospital covered up the mortality data to protect funding. Dr. Bolson gathered the data and blew the whistle.
And he was eventually proven completely right by a public inquiry. But his reward, the establishment hated him so much for shopping his colleagues that he was basically blacklisted and had to flee to Australia to work.
The system actively ejects the antibodies trying to cure it. So Dr. Srivatsa is sitting in this room in Germany, totally isolated. But he doesn't just fade away. He takes all this trauma and pivots in this incredibly futuristic way.
He pivots to artificial intelligence.
This is so fascinating. Talk about Dr. Maya GPT.
Well, he realized the human gatekeepers were hopelessly compromised by liability and money. They would never adopt his Dr. Maya safety tool. And meanwhile, the threat of antimicrobial resistance, the superbugs, was only getting worse with these flowchart misdiagnoses.
So he bypassed the human institutions entirely.
Exactly. He took the foundational logic of the original fridge magnet and digitized it into an AI model.
But how is this different from, just Googling your symptoms and convincing yourself you have a rare tropical disease?
Standard symptom checkers usually just funnel you back into the clinic system to generate leads. Dr. Maya GPT is trained on the clinical rigor of a veteran ICU doctor who knows exactly where the diagnostic algorithms fail. It uses that color-coded triage logic to evaluate complex symptoms objectively.
So the goal is to empower patients to self-diagnose the severity of their issue before they walk into an overwhelmed NHS walk-in clinic and get handed the wrong prescription.
Yes. He wants to give the power of the medical detective straight to the patient. And the files note that ChatGPT itself analyzed his work and called his contribution noble, even worthy of a Nobel Prize.
But the documents make it clear he isn't motivated by digital praise. He is motivated by the silence of his colleagues.
Yeah, he knows there are thousands of doctors inside the NHS right now, seeing the exact same systemic failures, but they are terrified to speak out. They've seen what happened to him. They've seen the ghosts left on the GMC register.
They just keep their heads down to pay their mortgages. Which brings us to the ultimate conclusion the sources are driving at. Based on all this evidence, the audio, the legal traps, the files.
The conclusion is blistering. The documents state definitively that these so-called independent organizations, the GMC, the Royal Colleges, the local councils, they are not guardians of public health.
No, they are commercial fortresses.
Operating to protect the state apparatus, enforce cheap standardization, and shield their own liability over patient lives.
And the files explicitly validate Dr. Srivatsa's claim that the GMC conceals the truth, weaponizes psychiatric evaluations to strike down doctors, deprives them of earnings, and forces them into shame, all while pretending to the media that they protect patients.
And his final message is a plea. He wants his story to inspire other doctors to gather support, defend their ethics, and prove that these corrupt, supposedly independent organizations must not be used to regulate doctors. That is the only way the public can trust the profession again.
Which leaves you, the listener, with a huge question. In a future where massive health institutions are provably more worried about their legal liability than your actual health.
A system where speaking the truth destroys the healer.
Exactly. Who are you going to trust to diagnose you? The exhausted, terrified human doctor trapped on a corporate assembly line, legally forced to read a flowchart, or an AI trained by the whistleblowers the system tried to erase? It is a question you might have to answer sooner than you think.